Under the golden walls of Buckingham Palace, a secret has finally come into the light. King Charles has been arrested, not for rumor, not for speculation, but after a hidden vault was uncovered, packed with truths the world was never meant to see. What lay inside was darker than anyone imagined. The real truth about Diana's death, secret dealings of the monarchy, stolen wealth, betrayals carved into the very heart of the monarchy. For centuries, the crown stood untouchable, until now. With the king in custody and the vault wide open, one haunting question hangs heavy. What other secrets remain buried? The arrest of King Charles. The morning began like any other in London. It was overcast, cool, and quiet around Buckingham Palace. Tourists had already started to gather near the gates, holding their cameras, waiting to take pictures of the famous guards. No one expected that within the next hour, history would take a turn that would shake the entire nation. At exactly 9 o'clock, the first black vehicles turned onto the Mall, the grand road leading up to the palace. They did not arrive with sirens or flashing lights. They moved in silence, only the deep hum of their engines breaking the still air. These were not ceremonial cars. They were unmarked, heavy, and escorted by police vans. People began to notice the sudden presence of armed officers stepping into position near the gates. The operation had been planned down to the minute. Scotland Yard's Specialist Crime Command, working in coordination with MI5, had prepared for weeks in secret. The warrant had been signed late the night before by a senior judge. Nothing was left to chance. The officers knew exactly where to go, exactly who to secure, and exactly how to move him out of the palace without chaos. At 9:06, the vehicles rolled directly through the main gates. The guards, already briefed in advance, did not resist or question the convoy. Inside the palace, the king was in his private study reading briefing papers and preparing for a small meeting scheduled later in the morning. What he did not know was that the corridors outside were filled with officers. At 9:11, 2 senior officers entered the study with a team behind them. They carried the official warrant, signed and stamped. The king was told that he was under arrest. His face, as described later by those who saw him, turned pale and tense. He stood slowly, adjusting his jacket, and did not resist. By 9:12, he was formally detained. No handcuffs were used, but his every movement was closely guarded. When the palace doors opened to the outside world, cameras, already focused on the activity around the gates, captured the figure of the king stepping out between 2 officers. He wore a dark navy suit, the same one he had put on earlier that morning. His hands were held together in front of him, not bound, but stiff and uneasy. He kept his eyes forward, avoiding the small crowd of tourists who were now gasping and pointing. The king was led down the steps, across the short path, and directly into the back of an armored vehicle. The door shut with a heavy thud. The convoy moved within seconds, pulling away from the palace and heading toward a secure location in central London. By 9:30, the news was everywhere and broadcasted by the mainstream media. The words on the screen confirmed what the world was struggling to believe. King Charles III had been arrested. The arrest had not been the work of one group alone. Scotland Yard had taken the lead, but they had been supported at every level. MI5 provided intelligence and surveillance in the weeks leading up to the operation. The Serious Fraud Office, responsible for investigating major financial crimes, had played a role in building the case. Even the Crown Prosecution Service had been brought in early to prepare for the possibility of charges. Every step had been carried out with secrecy. Only a handful of people inside the government knew what was coming. The risk of leaks had been considered too dangerous. If word had spread, the vault at Buckingham Palace could have been emptied, or worse, evidence destroyed. For this reason, the operation had been signed off in the late hours of the previous night and executed within hours. The king was not taken to a local station. The convoy went straight to a high-security facility in central London. The location had been prepared for days, with special rooms cleared and reinforced. Once inside, he was processed like any other detainee. Details recorded, personal items removed, medical checks completed. Though he was not treated roughly, the symbolism was clear. For the first time in modern British history, the monarch himself was no longer above the law. The Metropolitan Police issued the first formal note at 10 o'clock, confirming that a 76-year-old man had been arrested on suspicion of conspiracy, financial misconduct, and obstruction of justice. They did not name him directly in the text, but by then, every camera in the world had already broadcast the truth. For others, especially those who had long suspected secrets hidden behind palace walls, it was a moment of vindication. But one question lingered in everyone's mind. What discovery could justify taking the King of England into custody? The investigation that led here. The arrest of the king did not happen suddenly. It was the result of months of quiet, careful work carried out behind closed doors. The seeds of the investigation had been planted long before, but they only began to grow when small details started to appear that could not be ignored. It began with financial irregularities. Analysts inside the government noticed patterns that did not match ordinary royal expenses. Large sums of money seemed to vanish from accounts linked to public funds. Transfers were made through channels that were designed to be invisible, moving money into shell companies and offshore accounts. For years, these movements had gone unnoticed, hidden by the layers of tradition and respect that surrounded the monarchy. But times had changed, and new systems of monitoring left trails that could no longer be erased. The Serious Fraud Office became involved first. Their specialists examined the accounts and confirmed that the movements were not mistakes or clerical errors. They were deliberate. The sums were not small. They added up to millions. From there, Scotland Yard's Specialist Crime Command was drawn in, and a joint task force began to form. As the financial picture became clearer, another strand of information reached investigators. A former employee of the palace, fearful but determined, came forward with documents. This person had seen things that raised alarms: restricted areas inside Buckingham Palace, unusual instructions, and records being handled with unusual secrecy. The documents suggested that a hidden archive existed somewhere within the palace itself. At first, investigators struggled to believe it. A hidden vault, buried under one of the most secure and famous buildings in the world? But the testimony was consistent, and soon more evidence followed. Weeks passed as investigators gathered more details. MI5 became involved, running surveillance operations around the palace. Movements were tracked, deliveries were logged, and patterns began to emerge. Certain staff members entered areas of the palace at strange hours. There were doors and stairwells that were rarely used, but cameras showed activity in those spots during the night. By late summer, the task force had enough to present to a judge. A warrant was signed giving them permission not only to enter the palace but also to seize control of any hidden records and arrest anyone obstructing justice. The timing was crucial. Authorities feared that if the king or his closest circle discovered the investigation, evidence could vanish forever. The decision was made quickly. Within days, the operation was ready. The morning of the raid was not chosen by accident. It was selected for its calm schedule, when the palace was least likely to be crowded with visitors or formal duties. What the investigators did not expect was just how deep the secrets ran. They had suspected financial misconduct and hidden documents, but what they uncovered in the vault reached far beyond money. What was actually discovered in the vault? The vault discovery. The vault was not marked on any public plans of Buckingham Palace. It did not appear on tourist maps or architectural drawings. Even many members of the royal household had no idea it existed. It was hidden beneath the east wing of the palace, in an area that had long been restricted. Access was gained through a narrow stairwell behind a locked service door. The stairwell descended into stone steps that looked older than the rest of the palace, almost as if they had been preserved from an earlier era. At the bottom was a reinforced steel door fitted with electronic locks. Few people had ever passed through that door, and fewer still knew what was on the other side. When the task force entered, security officers had to use both mechanical tools and coded authorizations to break the system. It took nearly half an hour. Finally, the heavy door swung open with a groan, revealing a chamber that had been untouched by the public eye for decades. The first inventory shocked even the most experienced investigators. Files stretched back for decades, some bearing the insignia of official departments, others stamped as strictly confidential. Many of the documents appeared to have been removed quietly from government offices over the years. It was clear that they had been hidden deliberately. Among the files were binders filled with reports on financial transfers, evidence of accounts in offshore territories, and letters linking royal signatures to money trails that should never have existed. But that was only the beginning. In another section of the vault, investigators found personal correspondence and reports tied to the late Princess Diana. These were not the ordinary archives that historians would expect. They were private, sensitive records that suggested a very different version of her final years, and of the night she died. In sealed envelopes were memos between officials, discussing surveillance, security failures, and inconsistencies in the public story that had been given after the crash in Paris. The papers hinted at decisions that had been made behind the scenes, decisions never meant to be revealed. Alongside these were folders linked to other members of the royal household. Some dealt with property dealings, others with arrangements that seemed questionable at best. One section was devoted entirely to records of communications with outside parties, including business figures who had quietly benefited from secret deals. The vault was not a random collection. It was a carefully curated store of power, a place where information was kept hidden not just for protection, but for control. Whoever held access to those files could influence reputations, shield scandals, and guard the image of the crown at the expense of the truth. As the officers worked through the inventory, it became clear that this discovery was not only about money or private letters. It was about the foundation of trust itself. The vault showed a system of concealment that had operated for years, perhaps decades. When the first reports from the vault reached senior officials, the decision to move the king into custody was confirmed without hesitation. The secrets stored in that underground chamber were too explosive to ignore. They carried the weight of history, and they explained why the arrest had been necessary. Will these findings shake the very core of the monarchy, or will it answer the unanswered questions in the people's hearts? The darker files of the royal vault. The vault was not only about money or Diana. Hidden among the papers were files marked with the names of nearly every senior royal. Some of the papers went back decades. They showed arguments over succession, private disputes over property, and efforts to silence those who spoke out. There were records of phone calls tapped, staff monitored, and scandals quietly erased before they reached the public. One collection of papers dated back to the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. While she was loved by the public as a symbol of dignity, the files showed a different side behind closed doors. Memos revealed that during moments of crisis, she had approved strategies that placed the monarchy's survival above all else, even above family. After Diana's Panorama interview in 1995, documents showed Elizabeth urging her advisors to isolate Diana further, reducing her access and cutting her off financially. There were also notes from the 1970s and 80s showing how she had secretly interfered in government decisions when royal interests were at risk, despite the rule that the crown must remain politically neutral. For the first time, the files showed that Elizabeth had been aware of money being funneled into private estates, using public funds meant for other purposes. She did not stop it. She quietly signed off. One of the largest sections belonged to Prince Andrew. While the world already knew of his scandals later in life, the vault revealed they had started much earlier. Files documented secret payments made to silence accusations dating back to the 1980s. Internal palace letters showed that staff had raised alarms about his behavior with young women during overseas trips, but each time the issue was buried. Settlements were arranged quietly through trusted intermediaries with the aim of keeping the monarchy untouched. The vault also held evidence of business deals Andrew had made while acting as a trade envoy. He had promised access and favors to wealthy figures, pocketing millions in return. The monarchy had denied it for years, but the receipts and signed letters were sitting in the vault the entire time. Edward's files were smaller but still shocking. Papers showed that his production company in the 1990s had been secretly funded by money redirected from Crown estates. Publicly, it had been portrayed as independent. Privately, the palace had used taxpayer money to prop it up, fearing the embarrassment of a royal failure in business. There were also memos of family tension, showing how Edward had clashed with Charles over his role and future. At one point, Elizabeth herself had stepped in to calm the brothers. Perhaps the most chilling set of documents came under the category family correspondence. These were handwritten letters, reports of private conversations, and notes from advisors. They revealed that members of the family had often turned against each other in silence. There were letters from Anne, furious at Charles for bringing shame to the family with his behavior. Papers showed Andrew blaming Charles for not protecting him during his scandals. And more than once, Charles himself had written that his mother's decisions left him feeling trapped, treated like a servant to the crown rather than a son. Even Philip appeared in the documents as a hard and controlling figure, often dismissing Charles as weak and unfit for kingship. These words, never meant for the public, showed the family tearing itself apart behind gilded walls. Year after year, staff had compiled the evidence, boxed it, and buried it beneath Buckingham Palace. The monarchy had presented itself as a family of service and duty. But the vault revealed a family bound by secrets, betrayals, and lies. Queen Elizabeth had known. Philip had acted. Andrew had been protected. Edward had been shielded. And Charles, with Camilla, had carried the burden of it all into the present day until the vault forced everything into the light: the stolen public funds. Among the heaviest discoveries inside the vault were the financial records. Unlike the letters and personal files, these were cold and clear numbers. They spoke of years of money moving quietly, hidden beneath the surface of royal duty. The ledgers were detailed. They showed how taxpayer funds, meant for public service, had been redirected. Budgets that were supposed to maintain royal properties had been stretched far beyond what was needed. Extra amounts were moved into accounts under obscure names, then transferred again into offshore banks. The investigators traced some of these funds to the Caribbean. Other accounts surfaced in Switzerland, hidden behind shell companies. Some of the paperwork revealed connections to estates that had been purchased overseas, properties never acknowledged by the monarchy but owned through secret trusts. At first, the sums looked small, buried inside larger reports. But as the files were pieced together, the scale became staggering. Millions of pounds over decades had been siphoned away. Some of it was used for personal luxuries, renovations, jewelry, private travel. Some of it had simply disappeared, dissolved into the maze of offshore accounts where no public eye could follow. What shocked investigators most was how organized the system was. This was not sloppy bookkeeping. It was deliberate. There were cover letters showing how numbers were adjusted before reports were sent to Parliament. There were entire teams of accountants working under orders, ensuring that the real flows of money never appeared in official statements. One file described how public funds meant for community projects had been cut short so that the palace could cover private debts. Another revealed how money from the Duchy of Lancaster, the estate meant to support the reigning monarch, had been diverted to cover losses in secret business ventures. There were also receipts for transactions tied directly to Camilla. Payments disguised as charity support had ended up in accounts linked to her circle of advisors. Similarly, Andrew's overseas trips were repeatedly funded by budgets that had been padded for years, each time explained as trade missions, but shown on paper to be far more extravagant. The scale of it all was undeniable. For generations, the monarchy had been seen as living on tradition, funded by the people but serving in return. The vault exposed a darker truth. The people's money had been treated as personal wealth. When these findings became public, the backlash was immediate. Teachers, nurses, and workers across the country looked at the numbers and felt a deep betrayal. While public services had been stretched thin, while citizens had been told to accept austerity, the palace had quietly siphoned money for itself. Internationally, the shock was just as strong. Foreign governments who had provided support for royal programs discovered their funds had also been misused. What had been presented as cultural partnerships or charity work often ended as private enrichment. The investigators concluded that this was not a mistake of one monarch or one generation. The system had been built over decades, protected by silence and the appearance of honor. Diana's truth. When the vault under Buckingham Palace was opened, Investigators expected to find sensitive files, but they did not expect the weight of the documents tied to Princess Diana. Entire shelves seemed dedicated to her. Some were labeled with plain tags, others with codes, and a few sealed in heavy folders that had not been touched for decades. The first files pulled from the shelves went back to the early 1990s. They detailed her movements, her relationships, and her growing distance from the royal household. It was clear that every aspect of her life had been watched, noted, and preserved. Reports logged meetings with friends, trips abroad, even casual outings. Nothing was too small to be recorded. As the investigators worked deeper into the files, the tone of the documents shifted. Around 1995, when Diana began speaking more openly about her struggles, the files grew more intense. Security reports detailed her phone calls, her visits, and her protection requests. Some papers suggested that her worries about being followed and recorded were not paranoia, as some had once claimed. They were accurate. Surveillance had been real, and the records proved it. Then came the material tied to the summer of 1997. These files were kept in sealed boxes marked as highly restricted. Inside were folders from multiple agencies, some with official government seals. They included reports from intelligence officers, notes from meetings, and correspondence between officials and palace staff. The picture that emerged was very different from the public story told after her death. The public had been told that Diana's death was a tragic accident caused by reckless driving and the pursuit of paparazzi in Paris. The vault documents told another story. Among the files, letters and memos showed that she had expressed fear that she was being targeted and that her car might one day be sabotaged. Most disturbing were the technical reports. Investigators found an analysis of the vehicle she was traveling in on the night of the crash. These documents suggested irregularities in the car's maintenance and alterations to its structure. There were also notes about communications on the night itself, radio transmissions that were not disclosed to the public, and instructions that contradicted the official version of events. The documents also included photographs, diagrams, and transcripts. Some showed the crash site in Paris, but taken from angles that had never been released. Others included interviews and witness statements that were not part of the official inquest. These accounts pointed to gaps in the timeline, unexplained delays, and contradictions in the movements of key individuals. As investigators pieced through these materials, a clear pattern emerged. The official story had been managed. The public had been given one explanation, but behind closed doors, other possibilities had been raised and quietly buried. One of the most striking findings was a series of communications between officials in London and contacts in Paris during the night of the crash. These messages suggested that decisions were being made in real time about what information should be released and what should be withheld. The emphasis was not on full transparency, but on control. The vault also contained evidence that Diana's activities in the months leading up to her death had been monitored with unusual intensity. There were files on her relationship with Dodi Al-Fayed, her plans to travel, and even rumors of potential future engagements. Reading through the documents, the investigators realized they were looking at a parallel history. On the surface, Diana's death had been mourned as a sudden tragedy. Behind the scenes, powerful figures had worked to steer the narrative, ensuring that certain questions were never answered. For the investigators inside the vault, the effect was heavy. This was not just financial misconduct or hidden correspondence. This was the rewriting of history, hidden away in metal cabinets beneath Buckingham Palace. As the documents were catalogued, the decision was made to preserve every page as evidence. The boxes were sealed again, but this time under the custody of the task force, not the palace. Photographs and digital scans were made immediately to prevent any chance of disappearance. For the public, when the truth eventually emerged, it was devastating. People who had mourned Diana for decades now saw proof that their questions had been valid all along. The belief that her death had been more than an accident was no longer speculation. The vault confirmed that at the very least, key truths had been hidden. But that's not all. What they found next was more shocking. Camilla's dealings. Among the stacks of documents found in the vault, a large section was tied not to the late Queen, not to Charles himself, but to Queen Camilla. At first glance, they looked like business records and routine correspondence. But as investigators went deeper, the picture shifted. The files revealed contracts signed in Camilla's name or through trusted associates. Many of these contracts linked to private companies, some registered overseas, far away from British oversight. Payments traced from these companies often circled back into personal accounts or discrete trusts. The amounts were not small. They totaled millions, sometimes connected to land deals, sometimes tied to cultural programs that never fully took place. One box contained letters that showed Camilla's personal influence on these arrangements. She had written instructions, using intermediaries to secure funding or approvals. The document suggested she had more reach over financial and political matters than many had believed. While the monarchy had always claimed neutrality, the records painted a different story, one where private benefit and royal influence overlapped. There were also communications with foreign dignitaries and wealthy business figures. Some exchanges showed her promising access in return for financial support. Others tied her to the movement of funds that eventually vanished into shell accounts. For investigators, these papers were proof of dealings that could no longer be dismissed as rumor. The most damaging revelation came from internal palace memos. These documents showed that senior staff had raised concerns years earlier about Camilla's network of advisors and her private financial decisions. Instead of being addressed, those concerns had been buried. The vault made it clear. The warnings had been real, and they had been ignored. When the files became public, the fallout was swift. Camilla, who had fought for decades to be accepted by the people, suddenly found herself painted in the darkest light. However, this is not all. What do you think was discovered next? A nation in shock. The arrest of King Charles, the revelations about Diana, the stolen funds and the secret dealings shook the nation to its core. Britain, a country where monarchy was woven into daily life, suddenly faced the reality that the institution it had cherished was stained by corruption and betrayal. Crowds filled the streets outside Buckingham Palace. Some came in anger, shouting for justice. Others came in silence, standing with tears in their eyes, unable to process the scale of the fall. For many, the monarchy had been more than a government body. It had been a symbol of continuity, a thread tying generations together. That thread had now been torn apart. Princess Anne, once respected for her loyalty, became a face of quiet disappointment. She carried herself with dignity, but those close to her knew she was broken by what her family had done. Camilla withdrew entirely, her reputation in ruins, her role in history forever marked. The younger royals remained in the shadows, uncertain whether they had a future or whether the institution itself was too damaged to survive. The sense of betrayal was not limited to Britain. Across the world, people looked on in disbelief. The downfall of a king was not just a British scandal. It was a global story. Nations that had ties to the crown began asking questions. What did this mean for the Commonwealth? What did it mean for the countries that had kept the monarch as head of state? Inside Parliament, the debate turned fierce. Could the monarchy survive? Or had the vault's revelations destroyed it beyond repair? For the first time in centuries, voices began calling for a new system, one free from the shadows of royal secrecy. However, one thing was clear: history had changed forever. A throne that had once seemed unshakable was now cracked beyond recognition. The people had seen the truth, and no matter what came next, the age of blind reverence was over.